At 4 o'clock in the morning on August 25, 1941, the silence over Tehran was shattered not by the familiar sounds of a waking city, but by the roar of heavy aircraft engines emanating from the pre-dawn gloom. For the residents of the Iranian capital, accustomed to their country's status as a neutral oasis in a world ablaze, this sound heralded the collapse of their accustomed reality. At those very same moments, two men whose names struck awe in diplomatic circles arrived urgently at the doors of the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Soviet Ambassador Andrei Andreevich Smirnov and British envoy Sir Reeder Bullard. In their hands were documents officially called Notes of Protest, but which in reality served as a death sentence for the sovereignty of an entire state. They did not request an audience. They presented a fait accompli. While diplomats exchanged formal phrases in the cool halls of the ministry, a large-scale military operation, known in history by the codename Operation Countenance, was already unfolding on the country's northern and southern borders. This was the beginning of one of the most ambiguous and hidden episodes of World War II behind the official facade of history, when two irreconcilable ideological adversaries, the Soviet Union and the British Empire, united to commit an act of classic geopolitical aggression, cloaked in the high ideals of fighting global evil. The prerequisites for this invasion were rooted in the distant past, in the era of the so-called Great Game, when the Russian and British empires competed for decades for influence in Central Asia. Iran, or Persia as it was called in the West until the 1930s, was always regarded by the great powers not as an independent entity, but as a buffer zone, a resource base, or a strategic corridor. By the early 1940s, the situation had escalated to the limit. Reza Shah Pahlavi came to power in Iran, a man of iron will who sought to transform a backward agrarian state into a modern industrial power. His admiration for European modernization methods was evident, and in search of a third force, capable of balancing the age-old pressure from London and Moscow, he turned his gaze to Germany. By early 1941, German specialists held key positions in Iranian industry, on the railways, and in the communications system. For the allies of the anti-Hitler coalition, this became a perfect pretext. Official propaganda began actively to inflate the myth of a fifth column of German agents in Iran, asserting that thousands of saboteurs were preparing the ground for the seizure of the Middle East. However, the real figures told a different story. The number of German citizens in the country did not exceed 700 people, including women and children, and most of them were ordinary engineers and technicians. The true reason for Moscow's and London's interest lay not in the realm of fighting abstract espionage, but in concrete geographical and economic maps. The first and most pressing issue was oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, effectively controlled by the British government, owned the largest oil fields in the south of the country. In the context of a world war, the loss of control over these resources would have meant the paralysis of the British fleet and air force. The Soviet Union, in turn, after the German attack in June 1941, desperately needed a safe route for the delivery of military supplies from its Western allies. The Lend-Lease program required reliable routes, and the northern convoys through the Arctic were too dangerous. Iran, with its recently built Trans-Iranian Railway, presented an ideal bridge through which tanks, aircraft, and provisions could flow unhindered to the Soviet front. Thus, the fate of a neutral country was sealed in the offices of the Kremlin and Downing Street without the participation of the Iranians themselves. This was a cynical decision dictated by military necessity, which completely disregarded international law and those very principles of sovereignty for which the Allies supposedly fought. The war machines of the two powers moved simultaneously. From the north, units of the Red Army, including cavalry divisions and tank brigades, crossed Iran's borders. In the south, British forces, supported by the Navy and Air Force, began landing in Persian Gulf ports. The offensive was conducted according to all the rules of modern military art, but there was virtually no enemy. The Iranian army, into which Reza Shah had invested enormous resources and years of effort, proved to be a colossus with feet of clay. Soldiers, armed with outdated rifles, did not understand why they had to give their lives when their country was not officially participating in the war. In the very first hours of the operation, the Iranian Air Force was effectively neutralized directly on the airfields. Not only military targets but also residential areas of large cities, including Tabriz and Qazvin, were subjected to bombing, leading to numerous instances of civilian casualties. Soviet and British leadership justified these actions by the desire to prevent a greater tragedy, but for the people of Iran, it looked like undisguised terror. The situation was particularly acute in the Caspian Sea, where the Soviet flotilla conducted an operation to blockade Iranian ports. Iranian ships, having no chance in open confrontation, were either captured or disabled. In the south, British paratroopers captured the Abadan oil refinery, one of the largest in the world. Despite isolated instances of heroic resistance by Iranian officers who refused to surrender without orders, organized defense collapsed within 3 to 4 days. By August 28, 1941, the Shah was forced to order a ceasefire. However, this did not stop the advance of foreign troops. The occupiers sought to seize strategic points and secure complete control over communications. Tehran was encircled, and psychological pressure on the government increased with every hour. Reza Shah's internal drama reached its climax during these days. He, who considered himself the heir of great Persian kings, suddenly realized that he had become a hostage in his own palace. His attempts to appeal to the international community, including a personal address to the President of the United States of America, Franklin Roosevelt, went unanswered. Roosevelt, formally adhering to a policy of neutrality until December 1941, in fact fully supported Churchill's and Stalin's actions, answering the Shah with vague phrases about the need for a common victory over fascism. For Reza Shah, this was a betrayal by those whom he considered guarantors of world order. Domestically, his position also became precarious. The intellectual elite and clergy, long dissatisfied with the Shah's authoritarian methods and his pursuit of secular westernization, saw in the foreign invasion an opportunity for regime change. The Shah found himself isolated. His army had dispersed, his ministers were paralyzed by fear, and the people were in a state of shock and apathy. At this moment, the personal ambitions and fears of the key players came to the fore. Stalin, acting in his characteristic manner, viewed Iran as a security zone for the Caucasian oil fields of Baku. For him, any independent force in this region was a potential threat. Winston Churchill, on the other hand, acted according to the logic of imperial pragmatism, seeking to secure British dominance in the Middle East for decades to come. Their interests temporarily coincided, creating a unique and terrifying precedent of joint occupation of sovereign territory under the slogans of liberation. The relations between Soviet and British officers on the ground were steeped in mutual distrust. Memoirs of that time describe scenes where soldiers of the two armies, meeting on the demarcation line, exchanged wary glances, understanding that today they were allies only because it had been decided so in distant capitals. The philosophical and ideological conflict of this event was even deeper. The invasion of Iran exposed a fundamental contradiction in the policy of the anti-Hitler coalition. While proclaiming the fight for the freedom of nations and against tyranny, the great powers themselves acted with the methods of tyrants when it came to their strategic interests. The concept of a preemptive strike, which would later become so popular in international politics, was first applied on such a scale right here. If Germany attacked European countries, it was called aggression. But when the Soviet Union and Great Britain entered neutral Iran, it was presented as a forced protective measure. This double standard became the birthmark of the New World Order that began to form during the war years. The paradox was that, to save democracy in Europe, the nascent sovereignty in the East had to be destroyed. Iran became the first victim of this higher expediency, which would later justify many other local conflicts. On September 16, 1941, a decisive turning point occurred. Under immense pressure from British and Soviet representatives, Reza Shah was forced to abdicate. His figure was too independent and irritating for the occupying authorities. He was succeeded by his son, the young and inexperienced Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who at the beginning of his reign was little more than a puppet in the hands of foreign advisors. The old Shah was sent into exile, first to the island of Mauritius, and then to South Africa, where his life ended 3 years later in deep longing for his homeland. This event marked the final transformation of Iran from an independent state into a huge transit point. The country was divided into spheres of influence. The north was under Soviet administration, the south under British. Tehran became a common space where the interests of intelligence services of all stripes intersected. The lives of ordinary Iranians under occupation turned into a struggle for survival. Despite the enormous volume of goods passing through the country, the population itself suffered from an acute food shortage. The transport system was completely reoriented to the needs of the front, which led to the disruption of internal trade links. Catastrophic inflation began in the country. Prices for bread and basic goods soared tenfold, causing hunger in large cities. While Allied troops celebrated the arrival of new convoys of equipment, Iranian mothers stood in endless queues for meager rations. In the mid-40s, bread riots erupted in Tehran and other cities, which were brutally suppressed by the local police under the supervision of occupying patrols. The irony of the situation was that the Bridge of Victory was built on the ruins of the economy and well-being of those who provided that bridge. An important stage in consolidating the country's new status was the Tehran Conference of 1943. For the first time, the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, met face-to-face. They discussed the fate of the world, the opening of the Second Front, and the post-war arrangement of Europe. Iran was mentioned in these discussions only as a convenient venue for negotiations. To somehow smooth over the impression of the occupation, the leaders signed the Declaration on Iran, in which they solemnly promised to preserve the territorial integrity and independence of the country after the war. However, these promises were worth no more than the paper they were written on. In reality, the conference only confirmed that Iran was an object of bargaining, and its future depended solely on the consensus of the great powers. The security of the leaders in Tehran was ensured by thousands of soldiers and intelligence agents, effectively turning the city into a fortress where the voices of the Iranians themselves were inaudible amidst the noise of motorcades and the pomposity of official statements. The culmination of this historical drama came closer to the end of the global conflict. When the threat from Germany disappeared, hidden contradictions between the Allies surfaced. The Soviet Union was in no hurry to withdraw troops from the northern provinces of Iran. Moreover, separatist movements began to form there under Moscow's patronage, such as the Democratic Party of Azerbaijan and the Kurdish Republic. This was a moment of truth. It became clear that the 1941 occupation was not only a military necessity, but also an instrument of long-term territorial expansion. The world found itself on the brink of a new war, already cold, and Iran became its first battlefield. In 1946, the matter reached the United Nations Security Council. Only under powerful pressure from the United States of America and the threat of force did Stalin agree to withdraw his units. This was a tough confrontation between strong players, in which Iran's own interests were once again merely a bargaining chip. The lessons of those events resonate in the modern world with striking relevance. The history of the 1941 invasion of Iran teaches us that in grand geopolitics, there are no eternal friends and immutable principles, but only eternal interests. The concept of humanitarian intervention or preventive defense, which we often hear today, has its roots in those August days. It shows how easily noble goals can become a justification for violating basic norms of morality and law. For modern states located at strategic crossroads, this experience remains a formidable warning. Neutrality protects only as long as it benefits the powerful of this world. The Iranian tragedy of the 40s demonstrated that even the most sincere attempt to stay out of global madness can end in forced involvement if the shortest path to someone else's victory lies through your territory. The significance of this episode for Iran itself cannot be overestimated. The collective memory of the years of occupation, of national humiliation and famine, formed a deep distrust in Iranian society towards both the West and its northern neighbor. This feeling of injustice became one of the ideological foundations of subsequent revolutionary movements in the country. Iranians realized that their country could only be strong when it was able to defend itself, without relying on international guarantees or the good neighborliness of great powers. Today, analyzing those events through the prism of 80 years, we see how one shadow of the past falls upon modern conflicts, reminding us that borders drawn by the tank columns of liberators leave scars in the minds of peoples for many generations to come. Returning to that humid August night in Tehran, when the first bombs fell on the airfields, we understand that it was not just a local episode of a great war. It was a moment when masks were thrown off, and the world saw the true face of imperial policy, knowing no bounds or compassion. That enigmatic question that tormented Reza Shah in the last hours of his reign, "Why is this happening to us? We are not at war with anyone," found its bitter answer. Power always finds an excuse when it needs a resource, and the history of 1941 remains one of the most striking examples of how the most mundane and cruel ambitions for reshaping the globe can hide beneath the beautiful mask of fighting for a bright future. In the silence of modern United Nations meeting halls, echoes of those events are still heard, urging us to look not at slogans, but at the real movements of troops on maps, where the fates of entire nations are often decided by a single stroke of the pen of a great dictator or a democratic leader. Today, looking at contemporary international relations, we often encounter situations that seem new and unprecedented to us. However, if one looks closely at the Chronicle of August 1941, it becomes obvious that the methods of great politics change extremely slowly. Information warfare, the creation of an enemy image, the justification of aggression by national security interests. All these tools were honed to perfection precisely then, during Operation Consent. The Soviet-British invasion of Iran became a kind of standard for how imperial conquest can be wrapped in the guise of international solidarity. For a historian, this episode is invaluable material for studying the cynicism of power, and for an ordinary person, a reason to reflect on the price small countries pay for the ambitions of global players. Concluding this narrative, it is worth remembering once again those whose names did not make it into official reports. About thousands of ordinary railway workers, about peasants whose fields became parking lots for tank divisions, about soldiers who defended barracks in Tabriz to the last bullet. Their stories are the true fabric of history, hidden behind the pompous speeches of politicians. Iran in the 40s became not just a bridge of victory, but a sacrificial altar on which sovereignty was sacrificed in the name of a global goal. And until we learn to see the small tragedies of individuals and entire nations behind great victories, the lessons of the past will remain mere lines in textbooks, unable to prevent new mistakes in the future. The history of Iran is a mirror reflecting our own understanding of justice and honesty in a world where the right of might still too often dominates over the might of right. Each of us can ask ourselves, what would we have done in the place of Reza Shah or an ordinary resident of Tehran when at dawn the sky was covered by the wings of foreign planes? The answer to this question in the comments will help us better understand how deeply the sense of justice sits within us, and how we evaluate the actions of great powers of the past from today's perspective. After all, understanding history begins not with memorizing dates, but with an attempt to empathize with those who found themselves at the epicenter of historical storms. Iran in 41 reminds us that the true struggle for freedom begins not where armies clash, but where human dignity and the independence of one's home are defended. Ultimately, Operation Consent left behind not only established lend-lease routes and secure oil supplies, but also a deep imprint on the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. It predetermined many events of the Cold War and even today's contradictions. The cyclical nature of history brings us back to the idea that any act of aggression, even under the most plausible pretext, has long-term consequences that cannot be calculated in headquarters. The roar of planes over Tehran 80 years ago still serves as a reminder that, in a world engulfed in flames, there are no safe harbors, and that every act of liberation must pass the test of time and honesty of intentions. This chapter of world history, so rarely discussed in a positive light, remains an open wound, calling for deep reflection and honest acknowledgement of past mistakes, without which it is impossible to build a truly just future. Reflecting on these events today, we see how important it is to maintain a critical view of any official versions of history. What was called saving the world in 1941, from the perspective of Iranian sovereignty, looked like a treacherous attack. This clash of viewpoints creates the very depth of understanding necessary to avoid becoming a victim of propaganda in the present. The Iranian experience of the 1940s is a story of how easy it is to lose everything by being neutral, and how difficult it is to regain one's voice in the chorus of great powers. It is a story of power, betrayal, and the enduring value of national pride that survives even under the boot of a foreign soldier. I would like this material to be not just a set of facts for you, but a starting point for your own research into this complex topic. Could events have unfolded differently? Did Iran have a chance to maintain independence in that situation? These questions remain open, and each answer brings us closer to understanding how the mechanism of world politics truly works. History is not only what happened, but also how we evaluate it today, forming our values and views on the modern world. If you are interested in such a deep analysis of hidden pages of history, write in the comments what other events of World War II you consider undeservedly forgotten or distorted by official science. Your thoughts help us create content that makes us think and seek the truth beyond familiar patterns. For it is in disputes and discussions that the very understanding is born that makes us not just spectators, but conscious participants in the historical process. In conclusion, it should be noted that Iran in 1941 became a mirror reflecting all the contradictions of the era. It was a stage on which a drama of global scale unfolded, where actors in generals' uniforms decided the fates of millions without asking for their consent. And although the roar of planes has long since died down, the lessons of that night remain with us, reminding us of the fragility of peace and the importance of preserving sovereignty in an era of global change. May this story serve as a reminder that true victory is not only the defeat of the enemy, but also the preservation of humanity and respect for those who were weaker on the chessboard of history.